Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. Tonight is August the 17th, 2015. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Of course, the show is being pre-recorded on August the 16th, so please bear that in mind. Tonight we're going to talk about a couple of different things, but I wanted to touch on the Syrian issue first and try to delve into that as much as possible. We talked about that a good bit about 2 weeks ago. But I want to get into some detail, and if we have time, of course, we can address some of the vaccine issues, maybe the GMO issue, and then, of course, comment on the Republican primary. Although that's been some time ago, then maybe we could still make some points about it. But that's if we have time. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, I would encourage you to catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. And if you want to access the show's personal webpage on the network, you can go to ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. On that page, you'll find the archives, you'll find the links to my recent articles. You'll also find a number of other different things there as well, the YouTube video archive versions of this show. You can also catch my work as it comes out on activistpost.com and naturalblaze.com. If you're interested in my work specifically, then please, I would encourage you to go to brandonturbeville.com. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all the interviews, all the archives of this show. And, of course, there is a books tab there as well that you can click on, and that'll take you to the bookstore. And you can also access the show's webpage via brandonturbeville.com. To all the contact information there, the bio information, all that relevant information is at brandonturbeville.com. So you should be going there on a regular basis. Now, let's talk about the Syrian issue. And before we do, I'm going to be very coy here. I'm going to be very shadowy and tell you that we're going to have some working on a project. So if anybody's concerned, while the site hasn't had daily updates and that sort of thing, I would just simply encourage you that there is a project in the works, and that the site will be firing on all cylinders in the very near future. And there's also going to be some more different types of releases and that sort of thing. So people should keep checking back at brandonturbeville.com. So we hope to have something that can maybe influence the political discourse here in this country on a major level. So just keep checking back. Now, let's get into the Syria situation. We've got missiles raining down on Latakia. We've got safe zones. We've got talks of bombings, U.S. bombings, Turkish bombings. We've got the Kurds. We got all this stuff happening right now in Syria, and I think we need to explain it. Again, I did this a couple of weeks ago when I did the interview with Afra from Syria. But I wasn't able to go into as much detail before the interview as I would have liked. So let's take a look at this. Turkey had called in order to get the safe zone. So we're going to step back. They called an Article 4 NATO meeting. They've done this twice in the past. They did that in 2003, and they did that in 2013. And in 2013, when they called the Article 4 meeting, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States sent 2 Patriot anti-missile batteries, as well as trained soldiers, and the soldiers who had been trained in operation the anti-missile batteries. Each of those countries sent their soldiers. And Turkey, at this last Article 4 meeting, requested an emergency meeting to help with its border security due to the crisis in Syria. And, of course, we see how that turned out. Now, Article 4 allows any member of NATO to request assistance when they consider its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. The crisis in Syria, though, while we hear Turkey whine and complain about the dangers that Turkey is facing, And we're talking about particularly the area surrounding the Turkish-Syrian border is largely the fault of Turkey itself, right? Turkey helped train and funnel terrorists from inside its borders into Syria at the beginning of this crisis. So the crisis is entirely one of its own making. Now, on my website, you'll find a map of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Lebanon. And what you'll see on that is a highlighted area where there's an operational presence of ISIS. And what you'll see clearly is that there's a couple of supply routes, right? And it's coming from Turkey into Syria and then on through to Iraq. Now, you can clearly see through that map that the death squad fighters are coming from Turkey. Now, beginning in 2011, and actually you can go back as far as 2007, 2005 really, the U.S. had been arming, funding, and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and a bunch of other armed terrorist organizations to overthrow the government of Syria, also to fight Hezbollah in Lebanon and to cause destabilization in Iran and remove the arc of influence of Iran. And, of course, that includes any other government or group in the Middle Eastern, North African region that's friendly toward Iran. Now, they had billions of dollars in cash being funneled in the hands of terrorists, including al-Nusra, including al-Qaeda in Iraq, and including what is now being called ISIS or ISIL. And you can see by this map that I'm mentioning here that ISIS territory, the territories that they hold, butts up directly against Turkey's borders, and it has defined corridors that ISIS uses to invade south into Syria, right? This is because it's precisely from NATO territory that the terrorist group is originating. It's coming from NATO directly into Syria because Turkey is indeed a member of NATO. So ISIS was harbored on NATO territory. It was armed and funded by U.S. CIA agents with cash and weapons that came from the Saudis and the Qataris and the GCC and other NATO members themselves. It's non-lethal aid the U.S. and British sent, including vehicles that you see ISIS driving in. Obviously, that came from the U.S. and Britain and NATO in general as well. So ISIS is the product of NATO and the GCC, and again, it goes back as far as 2005. And of course, we can cite Seymour Hersh in The Redirection that was written for the New Yorker. We can also cite Michael Hersh and John Barry of Newsweek in the Salvador option to document that. So the idea was to create a situation where they would have a region-wide sectarian war to essentially eliminate Iran's arc of influence, going from its borders across to Syria and Iraq and as far west as Lebanon, the coast of the Mediterranean. So that's what they are trying to eliminate. ISIS, again, was harbored and funded and trained and armed by NATO and the GCC, Turkey playing an immense role in that fact. And of course, you can look at where that support became overt is the cross-border invasion of al-Qaeda into Qasab village in the Latakia province in the northwestern Syria. And that was a cross-border invasion of death squads that was coordinated with NATO and Turkey and Israel. And it was a situation where the death squads invaded from the Turkish border while Israel acted as Air Force cover and Turkey facilitated the invasion from inside its own borders. And that was well documented. You also got to keep in mind that prior to the rapid appearance and seizure of territory by ISIS in Syria and Iraq, we had European media outlets like Der Spiegel reporting that hundreds of fighters were being trained in Jordan by Western intelligence and military personnel for the purpose of deployment in Syria to fight against Assad. And they said the numbers were expected to reach about 10,000 fighters when the reports were issued in March 2013. Now, when ISIS appeared, the Western media and the European media outlets tried to spin the operation as training moderate rebels. They attempted to present these guys as more democracy-loving freedom fighters. But later reports reveal clearly that these fighters were actually ISIS fighters. And those fighters were ultimately funneled into Syria via Turkey. On October the 2nd of 2014, we had Turkey's parliament passing a resolution to allow the Turkish military to enter the sovereign territory of Iraq and Syria under the pretext of battling these ISIS militants that were funded by Turkey and the West. That same resolution also allowed foreign troops to use Turkish territory for the same purpose, and that obviously suggested that the Incirlik Air Force Base might soon be used by the United States for airstrikes against Syria. Now, that has been announced. There's been a formal agreement that was reached between the U.S. and Turkey for the use of Incirlik in this fake American ISIS campaign, anti-ISIS campaign. We'll get into that in a second. But the vote on the resolution regarding foreign troops on Turkish soil to be used in Syria was 298 in favor of the motion and 98 opposed. It was a pretty popular motion. Now, despite the claims that the vote was centered around defeating ISIS on its borders, the foolish, idiotic moron Prime Minister Recep Erdogan from Turkey inadvertently admitted that the real target of NATO would be the Syrian government. This is what the BBC is reporting here. It says, speaking in Parliament earlier on Wednesday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan urged the West to find a long-term solution to the crises in Syria and Iraq, pointing out that dropping tons of bombs on IS militants would only provide a temporary respite. While he said, quote, an effective struggle against ISIS would be a priority for Turkey, quote, the immediate removal of the administration in Damascus would also continue to be its priority. Erdogan also called for a buffer zone on the Turkey-Syria border, which would be enforced by a no-fly zone to ensure security, end quote. A buffer zone, of course, we've been talking about that for a long time. It's been part of a NATO agenda against Syria since the beginning of this crisis. Remember, it was under the guise of a humanitarian corridor or buffer zone in Libya that NATO bombing took place, and that bombing ultimately led to the destruction of the Libyan government, the murder of Gaddafi, the expansion of chaos and anarchy and genocide across the entire country. Now, we've also had public discussion about the creation of a buffer zone that goes back as far as 2012 with the Brookings Institution in a memo called Assessing Options for Regime Change. And let me just read some of the relevant passages here since we have some time so far. An alternative is for diplomatic efforts to focus first on how to end the violence and how to gain humanitarian access, as is being done under Annan's leadership. This may lead to the creation of safe havens and humanitarian corridors, which would have to be backed by limited military power. This would, of course, fall short of U.S. goals for Syria and could preserve Assad in power. From that starting point, however, it is possible that a broad coalition with the appropriate international mandate could add further coercive action to its efforts. Now, they go on even further in this document, and they point out that the crisis, if they worked with Turkey and Israel in close coordination, could help overthrow Assad by establishing a multi-front war. Let's see if we can find that passage. All right, here we go. It says, in addition, Israel's intelligence services have a strong knowledge of Syria as well as assets within the Syrian regime that could be used to subvert the regime's power base and press for Assad's removal. Israel could posture forces on or near the Golan Heights, and in so doing, might divert regime forces from suppressing the opposition. This posture may conjure fears in the Assad regime of a multi-front war, particularly if Turkey is willing to do the same on its border, and if the Syrian opposition is being fed a steady diet of arms and training. Such a mobilization could perhaps persuade Syria's military leadership to oust Assad in order to preserve itself. Advocates argue this additional pressure could tip the balance against Assad inside Syria if other forces were aligned properly, end quote. So, that's the discussion. Now, we've also known that Turkey has been whining and groaning and bitching for some time about the influx of Syrian refugees as a result of the humanitarian crisis in Syria that Turkey helped create again. So the most recent influx of refugees came from the city of Kobani, for instance, where ISIS fighters were herded by American airstrikes so they could reinforce the fighters already battling Kurdish and Syrian forces there. Subsequent refugees came from other borderline towns facing heavy fighting. Again, all of this created by Turkey. If they want to stop the influx of refugees, they could cut off the border entry points to ISIS, and the humanitarian crisis would soon resolve itself as the Syrian military begins to wipe up the monkeys from operational forces there. Now, the U.S. airstrikes have carved out a vacuum that is filled with extremists, right? That's uncontested by the Syrian army because they're forced to back off in fear of provoking further Western aggression. And that's the situation when that happens obviously deteriorates. Just like with Turkey staging a false flag operation around its border last year so they could trigger a war with Syria directly over this tomb of Suleiman Shah. And by supporting terrorists, resulting in a predictable humanitarian catastrophe that's spilling over into Turkey's territory, the vacuum that is being intentionally created here is meant to be filled with terrorists and NATO forces to protect them as they get closer and closer to Damascus in this buffer zone situation. Now, the Turkish agenda is not focused on combating ISIS. If it was, the Turks would have long ago sealed their borders with Syria, as they would have ceased training ISIS. They would have ceased facilitating ISIS terrorist groups going into Syria and Turkish territory, coming into Syria from Turkish territory, I should say. Now, Turkey is not requesting assistance for spillover violence or cross-border attacks. It's requested a military invasion using a problem that Turkey helped create to begin with as justification for that operation. And that is what it's essentially accomplished right now. The Turks are calling for buffer zones, but they don't need a buffer zone to end terrorism within their own country. What they need to do, of course, is seal the border. And of course, as I said before, we're all about solutions here. So let me throw out a couple of solutions during this radio program. So I'll do that later on tonight. So Turkey, what they need to do, they don't need a safe zone or a buffer zone. They need to seal the borders with Syria. They need to cease funding, training, and facilitating terrorists that are operating inside their own borders. They need a sting operation that nets up these individuals and these terrorist organizations, not the sting organization that we've had, where they nab a couple of terrorists but then sweep across the country arresting PKK members. No, we need a real massive sting operation to arrest ISIS members. So seal the border, stop funding terrorism, stop arming terrorists, stop training terrorists, stop facilitating terrorists, and have a massive sting operation of terrorist organizations. You also need, and this I say to Turkey, you need to get rid of Erdogan, right? His idiotic policies and his equally idiotic Islamist government. You've got to put aside this stupid idea of political Islam and return to a culture of secular governance. In other words, civilization. That's what you need. Forget political Islam. Islam has no position, has no place in politics. Islam needs to butt out and be the guard of the spiritual world, just the same as in any Western country where religion needs, in terms of government, to take a back seat, because unless you want a theocracy, then political Christianity, political Judaism, political Islam needs to be thrown by the wayside. You don't govern based on religion. So Turkey needs to abandon political Islam. Turkey has got to pursue a reasonable and fair policy toward the Kurds in its southeast. The Kurds in the southeast are being discriminated against. They are being treated unfairly. The Kurds are also some of the best fighters against ISIS that we've seen, and while not endorsing necessarily a Kurdistan just yet, it appears to be that this is a situation that is going to continue to manifest itself for many years to come, and you have to wonder whether or not a Kurdistan would not be some type of option in the future. And of course, this is coming from places where at least three different countries, four really, if you include Iran, that maybe a situation such as what we're seeing in the southeast of Turkey, could be eliminated by Turkey eliminating Islamist foolishness in terms of their own government and discriminating against the Kurds in the southeast, but also maybe by simply acknowledging the fact that these are a people who deserve their own territory, in whatever form that takes. But that's something to be dealt with down the road, not right now, not until the ISIS issue has been dealt with, and not until the NATO issue has been dealt with, not until the Americans and NATO are kicked out of the area either with their ISIS pets. That's when it's time to discuss the creation of a Kurdistan, and if that's viable and what form that would take if it is viable. So we'll return to that. But Turkey has sent every signal possible that it's not going to go along with the solutions that I've just mentioned. They've seen every signal possible that they intend to stick with NATO and the NATO line of destroying the government of Assad and replacing it with a government or governments beholden and favorable to Washington, Anglo-American establishment. And, I've said before that the creation of a buffer zone or a no-fly zone is tantamount to war and an open military assault against a sovereign secular government, and that's exactly what it is, and that's what we're seeing now. So we need to discuss the ins and outs of that issue as well. Need to discuss the nature of this no-fly zone. Now, let's look at this question. The Article 4 meeting that I mentioned to begin with concluded with little fanfare, right? No fanfare, really. No major decisions were made regarding a no-fly zone at the Article 4 meeting. In fact, that many observers tended to take the opportunity to sit back in satisfaction that the meeting was concluded without any announcement of further direct military involvement in Syria. And for a lot of people, briefly at least, that meeting was just the permission to sit back and claim that Turkey and the United States would never attempt a frontal assault on Syria. Well, the big decision wasn't made at the NATO Article 4 meeting. It was made bilaterally days before between Turkey and the United States. And that new agreement effectively created a buffer zone that would span from the Turkish border into Syria. It went from it goes from Azaz in the east to Jarablus, however you want to say it, in the west, as far south as El Bab. The width of the zone is about 68 miles, and it goes about 40 miles deep into Syria, which is right on the doorstep of Aleppo, the largest city in Syria. We'll talk more about the details of what that no-fly zone looks like in a minute. That zone, though, it's smaller than what Turkey and the U.S. have been calling for over the last few years. It won't even stretch the length of the Turkey-Syria border, or it doesn't stretch the length of the Turkey-Syria border, but it's a start, and there's a reason for the dimensions of that ISIL free zone is what they're calling it. So, true to form, the U.S. and Turkey have attempted to obfuscate the fact that their new agreement is the creation of a no-fly zone. It's because they renamed it an ISIL free zone. And this is the same tactic used when the term no-fly zone and buffer zone began to draw too much attention from the American people only a few years ago. Then the term became safe zone. Now the NATO group is playing semantics again and deeming the area an ISIL free zone. It's like it's the unveiling of a new soda, right? That's minus a crucial ingredient, like Diet Coke or something. It says Diet ISIS. Semantics have really served NATO and the United States well over the years. I mean, this is why they do it. A simple name change of terrorist organizations have made the Anglo-Americans able to produce moderate rebels as well as the most frightening terrorist organization the world has ever seen out of the same group of terrorists. So semantics have done well. The description of the ISIL free zone is that it's a distinguished area in which the Turkish and U.S. military will engage in aggressive operations against ISIS. It's said that this area will also function as a place where civilians displaced by the Syrian crisis may run to for safe haven, and where moderate rebel forces can maintain a higher presence free from battles with ISIS. Washington Post says, once the area is clear, the plan is to give control to as yet unidentified moderate Syrian rebel groups. That's ISIS. The United States and Turkey have differing interpretations as to which groups can be defined as moderate. No, they don't. It's ISIS. It's all the same thing. Quit trying to distinguish. The reality is that this ISIL free zone is nothing more than a forward operating base deeper in the Syrian territory, working under the direct protection of the U.S. military and Turkish Air Force. Now, keep in mind, there's been no mention of the question of what would happen if the Syrian Air Force began bombing ISIS positions in the ISIL free zone. Would NATO interfere? Would NATO shoot the Syrian planes down? What if Syrian Air Force began attacking the non-existent moderate rebels in the zone? Would NATO shoot the Syrian planes down for that? Well, if the answer to either one of those questions is yes, it's a no-fly zone. And the Syrian military, to be honest, is the only party in the Syrian crisis that maintains and uses an air force. So who would this be against? ISIS doesn't have an air force, right? So it's we've got to point out the justifications on which this ISIL free zone is based. They're nothing more than myths. And the first thing we've got to look at is this idea that there's such a thing as a moderate rebel force that's inside Syria. We've debunked that time and time again. There's no moderate forces fighting against Assad. The opposition was nothing more and never anything more than death squads and jihadists, snipers, terrorists, mercenaries, etc. The West may attempt to maintain images of moderate rebels, whatever, but the beheadings and the torture and the cannibalism, that's just too much to keep out of the news media. And of course, when it did leak out, when people saw what the animals that we called rebels were doing, then suddenly ISIS appeared to be, oh, those are the bad guys. The good guys, these good guys don't eat one another and torture innocent people. So the Islamic State was never a truly separate force from the cannibals operating in Syria since the beginning of the crisis. It was always on the ground in Syria. It was going by the name of Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda, the Free Syrian Army, Yarmouk Brigade, Harakat Azam. The name ISIS is nothing more than a name. But it's been immensely successful at drumming up American fear and support of military adventures abroad. And just, unfortunately, with the right amount of propaganda, Western audiences are easily convinced of just about anything. The second myth that we have to address here is that there's a war on ISIS being conducted by the U.S. coalition and Turkey. For two countries opposed to ISIS, you'd easily be convinced of the opposite after examining the facts on the ground and the results of their bombing missions. Turkey has long acted as a funnel and a conduit for ISIS crossing into Syria. The United States can be credited with the creation of ISIS. Aid being provided to the so-called moderate rebels. The U.S. and Turkey have directly armed ISIS, funded them, provided them with the necessary logistics and intelligence to conduct attacks in Iraq and Syria. And, of course, anything that's going to the so-called moderate rebels is going to ISIS, so bear that in mind. U.S. airstrikes allegedly against ISIS in Iraq and Syria have been questionable at best. U.S. airstrikes have targeted Syrian infrastructure, civilian areas, Syrian food storage facilities, etc. American Air Force has been notorious for dropping supplies to ISIS and firing on the Iraqi military, and that's not been lost on the Iraqis. In the instances where the U.S. has targeted ISIS, it's been an effort of death squad herding and border shaping or protection of western oil fields from terrorist brigades who may have gotten off the reservation. That's all it is. So even the idea of a buffer zone has been in the cards since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, and we just talked about that. Turkey has long been arguing for a no-fly zone, and now it's got part of a no-fly zone. The United States has been doing the same as well. So now now let's turn to the no-fly zone, because I really want to get into the details here, if we can, and what we have left of the show. The ISIL free zone, which we're going to call the ISIL free range zone, I guess. Very soon after the bombing campaign was launched, there was, and this is the bombing campaign from Turkey into Syrian territory, there was the announcement that Turkey and the United States had agreed to implement the ISIL free zone, the no-fly zone, the ISIL free range zone in northern Syria. And just prior to that announcement, we had Turkey, the situations in Turkey. We had the Suruk bombing. A bomb went off at a demonstration of largely Kurdish people who were demonstrating to provide aid for the people of Kobane. Well, a bomb goes off, and immediately the reports from Turkey are that ISIS did it. And unlike American audiences who immediately believe anything the little television screen or government officials tell them, the Turkish people knew exactly who was responsible. They blamed the Turkish government. They knew that ISIS didn't do this, or if that ISIS did this, it was at the direction of the Turkish government. So the Kurds, in their own astute capabilities here, they knew that it was the Turkish government. How did they respond? The PKK went out and killed 2 police officers, or at least we are told the PKK went out and killed 2 police officers. Turkey tells us that, and Turkey is known for its perfidy, at least in the last few years. So the response then is for the Turkish government to put out a dragnet sting operation where they nab up ISIS fighters and ISIS terrorists inside Turkey. And what happens is they go across the country arresting people, but the overwhelming majority of them are Kurds. They're not ISIS fighters at all. They're Kurds. So there's increasing violence between the Turks and the Kurds, and Turkey, Freudian slip there, decides to launch a bombing campaign in Syria against ISIS allegedly. But what do? They bomb the Kurds. They're bombing the Kurds in Iraq and Syria, and attacking them in the southeastern part of Turkey itself. So this is where we're seeing the battle lines being drawn. And so that's very soon after the bombing campaign, we have this announcement of the ISIL free zone. Now, Turkey, again, whining about the threat ISIS posed to its security after the Suruk bombing. The Suruk bombing, Turkey has demonstrated that the real target of its bombing campaign is not ISIS at all, it's the Kurds. So since the 1980s, Turkey has been locked in a political and often bloody military struggle with the Kurds inside its own borders. Turkish Kurds have provided political, military, and demonstrative opposition to the power structure inside Turkey for some time. At times they call for more rights, at other times they call for autonomy, and other times they call for outright independence. Now, Turkey has resisted any calls for Kurdish independence, and especially the creation of Kurdistan. They were both sides, Kurdish fighters and Turkey, were able to reach a peace deal, and lives on both sides of the border were able to return to relative normalcy after the Kurds declared a unilateral ceasefire in 1999. The ceasefire lasted until about 2004, when we had sporadic fighting that started to appear yet again, and it was becoming increasingly physical, increasingly dangerous. In 2013, peace returned again, or relative peace began to return again. But now Erdogan and his support for savages and monkeys in Syria have strained that relationship until pretty recently the violence has once again began to pop up. So there's two important reasons why Turkey is so obsessed with the Kurds within its own borders and with the Kurds in Syria and Iraq. First, it's the question of Kurdistan. This is sort of the big one. The creation of an independent country for the Kurds is beyond question for Turkey, particularly for the nitwit Erdogan, who apparently has delusions of grandeur so great that he believes he's going to eventually be the head of the new Ottoman Empire. Of course, he's wrong, and his miscalculations are much of the reason why his own country is imploding from east to west on virtually every level of society. Now, in addition to the Turkish Kurds, this is where it gets kind of confusing. The Turkish Kurds are the PKK, and the Kurds in Iraq are known as the KDP, the PUK, also known as Peshmerga. And the Syrian Kurds are generally known as YPG. So it's also, they're all there. And of course there's Kurds in Iran as well. All of them are partial to autonomy and independence. They're also aligned with the PKK in Turkey, some groups more aligned more than others. And, for instance, the Iraqi Kurds tend to be more aligned with the PKK. The PKK maintains some bases of operation inside Iraq. The Syrian crisis, which is facilitated and worsened by the Turks themselves, has threatened to destabilize Turkey also because of the Kurdish question in the southeastern part of its own country. And Erdogan should have seen that coming from a mile away. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't, maybe he doesn't care, but it's foolish not to care when so much of your country may engage in open revolt. The Syrian crisis it not only affected Syrian Kurds and forced them to become an effective military fighting force, in which they have, it's also forced Iraqi Kurds to do the same. So you've got two of the four elements of Kurdish society organized, trained, and fighting. So it's clearly a risk that the Kurds in Turkey, just right across the border, separated by an arbitrary line, would become emboldened and maybe seek independence or autonomy for themselves. All that would need to happen would be for the Turkish, Iraqi, and Syrian Kurds to begin coordination and cooperation, and you would have a de facto Kurdistan created. And Turkey does not want this. Given the savage nature of the Western-backed terrorists and their cross-border locations, it was a necessity for Iraqi and Syrian Kurds to communicate. That's a relatively easy task, and one which the Turkish Kurds began to take part in as well. The essential unification of three Kurdish factions in terms of communication and coordination and military operations and other methods of cooperation, that's just too much for Erdogan and his delusional mental state to bear. And Erdogan, and in Imperial Turkey's mind, if the Kurds united at an opportune time where the Iraqi and Syrian military were not available to put a rebellion down, separated from the Kurds by ISIS. In other words, you have these areas that are controlled by ISIS that's in between the areas that are controlled by Kurds and the areas that are controlled by the Syrian military. So the Syrian military can't get to the Kurds can't get to the Syrian military without crossing ISIS territory. If that happens, and if the Syrian military is unable to get to the Kurdish areas, and the Kurdish areas begin to unite, what you have, and this is the same situation in Iraq, what you have then is the de facto creation of a Kurdistan. And if you have the de facto creation of a Kurdistan, that very well may develop into a real Kurdistan. So the concern may manifest itself because of Erdogan and Turkish imperialism, not because of the Kurds. In other words, this never would have happened if nitwit Erdogan hadn't fallen for Obama and his foolishness with supporting ISIS. So if it's one of those ironic yet tragic storylines that you see in some of the classic tragedies, where the desire to prevent something is precisely the driving force for bringing that action about, and that's what is happening in Turkey. But the Turks are trying to put that down. Now, another reason that Turkey really wants to begin this bombing campaign, so adamant in its bombing campaign, is the need to protect the terrorist proxies who've been just beaten by the Kurds in recent months. Much of the northern part of Syria has been cut off from the Syrian military presence due to the fact that the Turkish border was just one massive conduit of terrorists, and therefore the terrorist presence was much more entrenched in those areas in the northern part of Syria on the Turkish border. Because of that, the Kurds have fought long and hard to retake and secure areas on the Turkish-Syrian border, which they've largely done. If we look at Carl Vick of Time magazine, got an article, Kurds are building a country with every victory over ISIS. This is what Vick says, quote, the recent run of victories in Syria illustrates the Kurds' battlefield capabilities. 6 months after winning in Kobani, the Turkish border town where as many as 1,000 ISIS fighters died, Syrian Kurd fighters on June 15th took another border town, Tel Abyad, creating a corridor on Syria's northern border and, far more important, cutting off the main supply line to Raqqa, ISIS's capital, 60 miles due south. On Tuesday, the Kurd forces, a Syrian affiliate of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, seized a military base known as Brigade 93, as well as the town adjoining it, Ain Issa. The victories put them within 30 miles of Raqqa, end quote. So, all the complaining that Turkey made in the international press, the truth is that the Turkish government does not want to destroy ISIS, it wants to destroy the Kurds. After all, ISIS is the terrorist proxy of the United States and Turkey and NATO and the GCC. ISIS represents a frontal assault against Assad that still allows NATO powers to lead from behind and avoid the direct military confrontation. But in the meantime, ISIS only represents the occasional threat to Turkey, in the occasional instance when a fighter might inch off the reservation to commit a suicide bombing or random beheading or something like that. But if you listen to what Carl Vick is writing about, what you'll see is that he's pointing out that the Kurdish victories in Syria as of late have effectively carved out the border line for a Kurdish area. And he's also pointing out that the Kurds are such an effective fighting force. So why would Turkey decide to bomb the Kurds who've dealt such a heavy blow to ISIS over the last few months? Well, the answer is simple. It's to protect ISIS and to reopen its supply lines. We've got a map on BrandonTurbeville.com, and it's very important. It's a great map to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. This map will show you, it's a map of Syria, but you can also see Turkey there as well. And it's color-coded, right? You'll see an area where the Syrian government is in full control. You'll see an area where the Kurds are in full control. You'll see another area where the death squad fighters are in control. The so-called rebels and all that, you'll see where they're in control as well. So you'll see all these areas. What you'll notice if you look at the northern border of Syria and the southern border of Turkey, that borderline area there, you'll see all the way to the very tip of the northeastern border of Syria. That's where the Kurdish control begins. And go all the way west, almost to the end of the northern border, but not quite. You'll see that's how far the Kurdish control extends. Basically, from the, let's see if I can give you the name of the town here. Well, I'll give you the town. I'll try to explain this better. From in the northern portion of Syria, the very northeastern tip, all the way to about well over half, I'd say 3/4 of the country at the northern border, it's controlled by Kurds. There's an area that is controlled by ISIS then, and that goes from Jarablus in the east to Dabik in the west. But then from Dabik to that area west all the way to the end of the Turkish-Syrian border, it's Kurdish control again. So it's almost like an enclave. So where is the ISIL free zone going to be implemented? Well, it's going to be implemented in this area that I just described, from Jarablus in the east to Dabik in the west. So what we're seeing here is the ISIL free zone is being declared right over the ISIL zone, right? The ISIL free range zone. And the idea is that they're going to prevent the Syrian military from bombing this area. They're going to prevent the Kurds from bombing this area. In fact, they're bombing the Kurds in the area that the Kurds hold. It's clear that they're trying to keep the supply lines open. Now, in this little area, in this little pocket of ISIS control, if the Kurds were to take this territory, this little 60-mile strip of ISIS-held territory, then what would happen? Well, what would happen is that the ISIS supply lines in Turkey would immediately be cut. They wouldn't have any way to get ISIL supplies in through the Turkish border. The Kurds have already cut off ISIS supply lines on those areas that they control in the north. If they took over this small sliver of territory, the supply lines would be gone. ISIS would not be able to get supply lines to Raqqa. They would not be able to get supply lines anywhere else from Turkey, and this is the main place they're coming in. So you'd have to go to look at Lebanon, but the Lebanese-Syrian border is largely controlled by the Syrian military and Hezbollah. There's a couple of areas that they still have to mop up, but that's going pretty well. So you have to look at the southern borders, and you've got Israel, but the Syrian military is pushing toward closing those supply lines if they haven't done so already. And of course Jordan, which the Syrian military is also pushing fairly well in terms of closing those supply lines down as well. And that's largely been shut down. So you see what would happen would be that the Kurds in the north would have sealed the border and the supply lines. You see now why the West is so adamant about the ISIL free zone, right? They want to protect the supply lines. Now, that zone that I just said is about the exact dimensions of the ISIS supply lines coming in from Turkey to Syria. And again, as I said, if either the Syrian military or the Kurds were able to capture this small section of land on the border, then ISIS supply lines would entirely be cut from the north. And with Assad's forces tightening their grip in the south and the southwestern portions of the country, and the Syrian military and Hezbollah cracking down on ISIS movements on the Syria-Lebanese border, ISIS is essentially going to be cut off from most of the avenues of outside assistance. And that's the reason that Turkey has announced such a heavy bombing campaign against the Kurds, alongside an alleged campaign against Assad. The latter one is questionable, to say the least, against ISIS. I mean, not Assad. They're definitely questionable about ISIS. The campaign against Assad, however, is clear. The American airstrikes against ISIS, again, as I mentioned earlier, have largely targeted Syrian infrastructure and civilian areas. And those areas where ISIS has been struck, it's pretty much nothing but death squad hurting. So we should call the ISIL free zone the ISIL free range zone. It's nothing but a forward operating base for these fighters. Now, lastly, again, we have just want to mention the United Nations. Well, no, we'll get into the United Nations in a second. Well, we're running low on time, so let's address the UN. Right, the United Nations. As we've been seeing ISIS gains across Syria being televised all over the Western media, the UN has publicly announced that it's too soon for another Syrian peace conference. Now, a lot of people might be confused about that because the UN is always calling for peace, and any given confrontation, usually half-heartedly calling for peace, but they're calling for peace, and this time they're not. They're saying, just throwing up their hands and essentially declaring it's no use. The official reason for the UN declining to restart peace talks is that two sides in the Syrian conflict couldn't agree on the most vital issue at hand, and that's the Assad government's transition from power. Now, at Geneva II, the Syrian government participated in the negotiations but rejected the forced abdication that was being demanded by terrorists and NATO. And the terrorist and U.S. puppet contingent would hear of nothing that didn't require a transition without Assad in power. After a communique was issued by the United Nations Secretary General that all parties had agreed upon the need for, quote, a transitional government body with full executive powers, end quote, the U.S. came out and said that in that type of transitional government, Assad could have no place, and that essentially threw all the work of seemingly genuine parties like the Russians and Syrians, just threw it out the window, essentially. It wasn't the Syrians that did that, it was the United States, typical. So it's got to be remembered that the United Nations, while it's attempting to appear neutral during these types of discussions, and even during Geneva II, it was clearly pushing for a transition. The UN was only interested in negotiating terms of that transition as opposed to whether or not the transition would take place in the first place. Right? It never really should have been taking place. This is what the AP reports. Staffan de Mistura, who's the UN Special Envoy tasked with finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Syria, he, quote, said that the most polarizing element in the roadmap to peace adopted by key nations in Geneva in June 2012 is the formation of a transitional government with full executive powers. That is the starting point on the roadmap which ends with elections and would require Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to relinquish power at some unspecified point, end quote. Now, de Mistura is an interesting guy. He says he recently said that he has held talks with over 200 individuals, both Syrians and non-Syrians, about finding a political solution in Syria, and that there was widespread support for, quote, a managed, phased, gradual or controlled transition, avoiding the repeat of Libya and Iraq, end quote. He didn't name the non-Syrians that he had talked to or exactly why non-Syrians should be involved in determining political transitions in Syria, but he is clearly negotiating, and you can read negotiating as planning with outside forces to oust Bashar al-Assad and the political mechanism that is going to emerge to take his place once he's ousted. De Mistura is also committed to the U.S. line that the Geneva II agreement requires that Assad step down at some point in the future. So that's interesting to point out also. But the real reason for the UN refusal to engage in any more peace talks is related to something else, and it's not politics so much as it is the developments on the ground. And one thing that is patently obvious in terms of the UN's outlook on the Syrian crisis is that when Assad gets the upper hand, it's time to talk peace and immediately declare a ceasefire, or at least in the areas where he's getting the upper hand. When Assad falls behind, ceasefires have failed and peace talks are no use, and we've got to do other things, right? Options for negotiations may be offered if it's deemed that the Assad government may be losing heart, or if enough territory is being taken away to warrant a desire for a bargain. So, in other words, the UN has become more and more transparent in the way it addresses potential for peace in the Syrian crisis, and it has nothing to do with peace. It has to do with the fact that the UN is acting as chief negotiator for terrorist proxies. The UN is functioning as a slowdown mechanism for Assad victories, and it ignores any calls for ceasefires when Assad is losing. Remember, the UN was all too happy to join in with a ceasefire peace treaty when Assad was crushing terrorists in Aleppo earlier this year, just like the refusal that we see now to reconvene negotiations seems to be timed with the ISIS push west, because there are some ISIS victories recently. The UN's February ceasefire was conveniently timed to halt the Assad government's progress in the largest city in Syria. So we see whenever Assad is about to crush the death squads, we see the UN rushing in and say, no, we need peace. We need peace. Let's get some supplies to civilians, and let's talk about this. When it's the opposite, when the death squads are surrounding Syrian military forces, then the UN it resembles the sound of crickets. So Tony Carlucci of Land Destroyer, he points this out very well. He says, quote, "It is curious because talks of truces were completely absent just as recently as 2011, when both organizations, the UN and NATO, backed hordes of terrorists sweeping across Libya, committing abhorrent atrocities, including the systematic genocidal extermination of Libya's black communities," end quote. So, NATO and UN peace treaties only appear when NATO terrorist proxies encounter serious trouble on the battlefield. As I said, this last round of talks, quote-unquote talks, centered around the topic of what a transition from power might look like for Assad. It didn't consider the fact that the Syrian crisis is made up mostly of foreign terrorists backed by NATO and the West, and indeed the admission of such a fact would eliminate most of the claims made by the opposition in NATO that Assad has lost his legitimacy and that there's any justification whatsoever in a push to force him down. Staffan de Mistra's statement that it's too early to restart negotiations is becoming clearer and clearer, that if Syria wants the UN to come to the table with a peace plan or a ceasefire agreement or some other negotiation proposal, maybe it should begin winning on the battlefield again and do so in a decisive fashion. Clearly, that's the only thing that's going to get the UN to the table, is if the Assad government starts decisively winning battles there. So, we want peace in Syria, but not at the price of the loss of sovereignty of the Syrian nation, the Syrian people, and the right of self-determination. So it's just another example of the insidious nature of the UN. Okay, we're not going to be able to talk about the vaccines tonight. We've run out of time. We'll try to touch on the vaccines next week, maybe of the GMOs, even the Republican primary, or something related to the elections, because we're going to have to do that. It's going to become more and more important as we move forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening tonight. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.